CoinDesk writer Sage Young has a new piece out this morning taking a look at the so-called white hat hacker industry. The term itself comes from old Western movies where you could tell the good guys from the bad guys by the color of their hats. They were all gunslingers, but some of them were in it for themselves and some of it were in it to save the townfolk. In the world of computer security, the comparison is pretty direct. Black hat hackers wreck systems for fun and profit, while white hats try to keep the web safe by finding and reporting issues before they're exploited. But things get a little bit messier when you get into the world of Web3. In a token-powered world, basically everything is financialized, and the lines get pretty blurry pretty quickly. When a bridge or smart contract is compromised, we on this show often don't know whether it's a malicious black hat robbing the blockchain bank or if it's a bunch of good guys who got there and are looting it first. And that's got at least one group of self-described white hats who took and returned about $2 million out of the recent Nomad hack, asking for more clarity. I think it's a tough ask, but I think it's an important topic. So I'm kind of curious for your thoughts on this one, Jen. Like, you know, we talk about these stories a lot in terms of like, hey, was this white hat? Was this black hat? Like, what are we actually doing? You know, are people returning? What's a fair bounty? You know, there's just like a laundry list of questions that come into line here. How do you see it?
As you were doing your intro, I just imagined like pew, 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 pew. Anyways, I know in the story that there calls for some regulation around white hat hacks, right? I think about halfway down the story, we hear from a white hat hacker that said, you know, I don't really know how I can continue because I'm not really sure what the regulatory landscape looks like. Wouldn't that be so progressive if we got to the point where regulators were looking at white hat hackers and putting together real frameworks so that we could progress and solve these problems that regulators talk so much about? That would be amazing. I unfortunately don't think that we are going to advance at that level. And when I was reading the story, I thought, you know, maybe Adam, you can explain to me the logistics or maybe the history here, but wouldn't it make sense for white hat hackers to maybe come in-house on many of the projects? So, you know, when we watch movies, in the movies, we see the FBI hiring hackers, hiring people who just came out of prison for hacking. Isn't that feels like the industry could benefit from bringing some of these hackers in-house? But is there something that has happened historically or logistically that is preventing that from happening?
Yeah, so white hat hacking has always been more of a cottage industry than it really has anything formalized. Really, again, just like script kiddies and people who are out there who have the choice of, hey, I found this thing, or hey, I'm looking through this code anyways just because I'm curious. Oh, hey, I found something. What do I do with it? Do I exploit it myself or do I report it? Typically, what will happen is that it will get reported by a white hat, and then it comes time to negotiate. Typically, around, hey, do you have a bounty program? Are you going to pay me money? You know, like, and sometimes white hat hackers, nominally, like people who are trying to do good, will actually be like, hey, I found something, but I'm not going to tell you unless you pay me. There have been organizations that have been out there going back to the very early days of crypto. There were a couple of groups where basically they were infrastructure for people who wanted to do this type of work, to then have the kind of company or organization then work with and contract with other groups out there to then have their sorts of groups try to find problems within these systems and try to earn bounties. A lot of time these are people out of Eastern Europe. A lot of times these are people out of Asia, who have relatively lower costs of living compared to here. I think the big challenge around it just is that, like, you have to be a pretty big company to be like, hey, we're going to employ a couple of people full time to just try to break ourselves, to like break our stuff and then figure out what's going on there. There's QA teams, quality assurance, but the actual white hat compromises, can't say that at all today. That's a little bit more of a specialized thing. So I think it's hard to formalize this because the flexibility that's inherent with it is actually helpful, I think, a lot of times. Whereas if there were hard and fast rules about this, that might actually limit some opportunities, to find problems that aren't anticipated by the rules. Wendy, I'll kick it over to you.
Well, governments use like third-party white hat hackers to do things. I mean, and there's not really a lot of different rules about it. It's just something that they kind of do. And I guess it would be a cool job. I don't know. I'd have to ask somebody that I know that does this. But anyways, we do have crypto projects that ask for bug bounties. All of them are actively looking for white hat hackers, but they're not really coming out and saying that. They're like, hey, we're going to give this to community. There's bug bounties. Like anytime I like review a project, that is something that I look for. Does the community actually care? Are they, incorporating some of their community members to actually test some of this stuff out? That's a really important fundamental aspect of these projects. So we do see that happening, but it's just not formalized. And again, I don't think the US government is going to give any type of guidelines as to how this should be regulated, because it's a very hard industry to regulate. But at the same time, they are hiring third-party contractors to do this type of work in-house. So who knows?